Eater of Millions shouldn't be a good card. It has a ridiculous summoning condition, it's not a combo card, it's not an archetype card, it doesn't even really do damage that often, and it doesn't come with a protection effect, and yet I keep finding myself putting it into every rogue deck that I've played the past couple months, and it's seen a ton of competitive success in Trickstar decks and some other rogue decks as well. In today's video, we're going to break down the 4 effects of Eater of Millions, talk about why it wasn't played when it came out, and why it's being played so often right now. Anyway, let's jump right in with the first effect that I want to talk about, which is its ridiculous summoning condition. Have you guys read this? It's really insane and definitely asks a lot of the person that wants to bring this thing out. So this card cannot be normal summoned or set. It must be special summoned from your hand by banishing 5 or more cards from your hand, field, and or extra deck face down, and cannot be special summoned by other ways. So the face down banishing is like the most permanent way to get rid of a card. Very few cards in the game can interact with face down banish cards. Some of the only ones that can are like Psyframe Lord Omega. Outside of that though, cards like Burial from a Different Dimension can't really access those, and a ton of other cards really can't touch the face down banish cards. It's pretty darn permanent. That's part of the reason why Pot of Desires is such a highly controversial card, because there's not any great ways of interacting with the cards that you banish off of it. So this card is asking you to banish 5 cards from your hand, field, or extra deck. What about this? So the hand and field is like the worst way to summon this thing. If you're doing that, you're probably losing, because at that point you're summoning this thing as a minus, potentially a really big minus. You really want to summon this thing without taking any sort of minus in card advantage, which requires you to banish the cards from your extra deck. Now what does that mean? Well, that means that you're essentially playing with a 10 card extra deck when you summon your first Eater of Millions, and if you summon a second one by chance, you're now playing with a 5 card extra deck, and that's a lot to ask of someone, because if you guys look at a lot of discussions right now, it's people talking about how we need a 20 card extra deck or a 25 card extra deck. So the fact that Eater of Millions is demanding that you play with a 10 card or a 5 card extra deck is absolutely insane. Its effect must have a huge payoff for people to be playing it, or it's being played in decks that aren't using the extra deck at all. Now it is worth noting that this thing can banish more than 5 things. There isn't a ton of scenarios where you'd actually want to do that, just because you want to like save those cards in the extra deck just in case you draw a second copy of Eater Millions. But this card does gain attack, so if you look at the second effect, which is this card gains 100 attack and defense for each face down banish card, you can kind of see a particular scenario where you really need to close out a game and you just banish your entire extra deck. So this card doesn't just gain attack off of its own summoning condition, it also gains it off of, like, if you or your opponent activated Pot of Desires, this thing will go up by 1,000 attack, and that's really cool. It also has an effect that we'll get to in a second that banishes cards as well, but just in general, notice that you're going to summon this thing at usually either 500 or 1,500 attack, but we're really not using it for the attack stat, we're using it for its last effect, but we'll get there in a second, hold on. So this card's third effect is this face of card and field cannot be tributed nor used as material for a fusion, synchro, or exceed summon. So this effect is kind of supposed to be meant as a drawback. In fact, though, this gives its only protection effect. The fact that it can't be tributed means that you can't kaiju this thing, which is really useful, I'd say, when your opponent actually does have a kaiju and you're sort of controlling the board with Eater of Millions. In general, though, this is meant as a drawback. You can link summon with this thing, but you can't use it for a tribute summon, you can't fusion with it, you can't synchro with it, and you can't exceed with it, although I'm not sure you'd really exceed with it because it's level 1, so that doesn't really help. But in general, this effect does come off as sort of a benefit, because you probably weren't going to use this for any of those other summons anyway, but the fact that it protects itself from kaijus is pretty relevant, because a lot of cards right now simply just lose to kaijus, which means that a card like this that has a built-in protection effect for it is going to have a slight benefit compared to other cards like it. Anyway though, let's look at the final effect, which is the actual reason that you'd want to play Eater of Millions in the first place, because if it didn't have this effect, you definitely wouldn't want to play it. I mean, if you look at those other effects, they're okay, they're kind of asking a lot of you, but this last effect has to really knock things out of the park, and it kind of does. It looks good in practice, but not so much on paper. But let's just read that real quick. So once per turn, at the start of the damage step, if this card battles an opponent's monster, you can banish that opponent's monster face down. If you're underwhelmed by that, don't be surprised, because that effect doesn't seem like that big of a payoff. You know, I've made so many videos at this point talking about how cards like the Egyptian gods aren't really worth their 3 tributes, and Eater of Millions is requiring you to do a lot of different things. It's a card that could potentially brick your hand because it's not part of an archetype and it's not a combo card. It can't even really be played on turn 1. It's more of a going second card. And despite all of this, its effect is fairly, on paper, mediocre. It doesn't even gain you advantage. I mean, it does every turn take out 1 card from your opponent's side of the field, but that's it. And this thing doesn't really have a ton of attack unless there's been a Pot of Desires, because basically what happens is each time you attack something, it's going to get banished, and then it gains 100 attack and defense. So if you just summoned it with its own effect and haven't used Pot of Desires, it's only going to be at 600 attack after that first battle, and then 700 after the next one, and so on and so forth. That's not a lot. This card is basically a perfectly designed board control card, and that's not going to be good in every single format. Now, I do want to point out that the second effect is once per turn. However, it does activate on either player's turn, which means that if your opponent wants to get rid of this thing, they're going to have to attack it twice, and the first thing that they attack with is probably going to be Banish. Now, I will say that the one time that attack boost really does come in handy is when you have activated Pot of Desires, or your opponent has activated one, and you've banished a couple monsters, because what happens is eventually Eater of Millions gets up to like 1800 attack, or 2000 attack maybe. I think that's like the highest it usually goes. And at that point, your opponent's in a weird spot, because now they have to summon 2 monsters over 2000 attack to actually kill this thing, where before, when you first summon it, it's not that difficult because it's only at like 500 attack. So it's not hard to get something that has like 1000 attack to run it over, but to get to 2000, a lot of times you're investing cards at that point, like extra deck monsters, and then they're just going to get banished anyway, so it's kind of hard for your opponent to actually deal with this card. But what do I mean by this card is strictly for board control? Well, you can see you're not going to really be OTKing any opponents with this card. All you're doing with this thing is breaking boards and putting your opponent in a weird spot. This thing is spout removal for any monster in the game, basically, and because it banishes a card face down, they miss all of their graveyard effects, and your opponent also can't really get those cards back, which is sort of the same thing that I talked about with the first effect, where yes, it is a downside that you can't get those cards back, but the fact that this has a battle effect that lets you banish your opponent's cards, it means they can't get those cards back either unless they're playing Cypher Lord Omega, which most decks aren't. So this card is basically a once per turn, get rid of any of your opponent's monsters for free, and yeah, it's tough to deal with. So why is this thing so tough to deal with? Well, when this card came out, it was in Raging Tempest, which is a set that had Zodiacs, and no one played this. No one played this way up through the summer, and then it wasn't until the ban list that hit Zoo that people actually started playing Eater of Millions. And the reason for that is that this card is terrible against removal. Ironically, a card that is a piece of removal for anything is bad against removal. So what does that mean? Well, it means that it's bad against Zodiac Dryden. It means that it's bad against Spiral Sleeper for the most part. Any card that destroys monsters is just going to rip apart Eater of Millions, because this thing has 0 protection effects outside of that tributing protection, which, like I said earlier, isn't really it's not meant to be protection, but it turns out to be protection. But yeah, so this card, it just gets destroyed. It's so bad. Summoning this thing and then having it instantly be destroyed by Zodiac Dryden is so bad. I mean, yeah, technically you baited out the Dryden effect by summoning it, but in general, that's not worth banishing 5 cards in your extra deck. It would have been a lot easier just to activate a Dark Hole, activate a Regeki. So the times that you get value out of Eater of Millions are when you can repeatedly remove your opponent's cards, and it just gets to a point where they're spending so much time dealing with the Eater of Millions that you're allowed to do your normal plays. So I like this card in Frogs a lot because you can summon it, you can start killing stuff, and then you summon a Totally Awesome eventually, and then you get a Dupe Frog out so they can't attack the Eater of Millions. It just puts them in a weird spot where every turn they have to summon a lot of monsters, otherwise Eater of Millions can just spot removal everything and let you attack directly with your other monsters. What's really interesting is that this card actually shows why Neospatian Grand Mole is on the ban list. If you've ever looked at the Forbidden Limit list and wondered why Neospatian Grand Mole is on there, it's for the exact reason that Eater of Millions could potentially end up on there if Konami really wanted to hit it. So basically what would happen is that you would go first, normal summon a monster, and then your opponent would go, they would set a monster or normal summon something, and then on your turn, you would summon Neospatian Grand Mole and just bounce back the thing that they set. In that case, it was really hard for them to actually get a board going, and that's pretty much what Eater of Millions does, except it's a lot more permanent because it's banishing the monster face down. So this card wasn't good when it came out because of the Zoodiac Trident, and it wasn't really played in Spiral format, but as soon as Spirals got hit, oh man, this card started appearing in every single Trickstar deck as basically a staple 3 of. Trickstars are a deck that really lacks spot removal. It's really hard for Trickstars to win with only using Trickstar cards. They either are FTKing you with Droll and Lockbird, or they're flipping Scapegoat, or in modern times they're summoning Eater of Millions, because Eater of Millions really helps Trickstars actually break apart boards. And this card's good against negation. If your opponent ends with like a Vortex Dragon or Tornado Dragon, you can just bait out the Vortex and then summon Eater of Millions and banish it. That's really powerful. It's such a powerful piece of spot removal, and in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! In this format in particular, a card like this is extremely valuable. There is so little destruction on your own turn anymore. I mean, yeah, there is Masterpiece, and this card is pretty bad against Masterpiece, but other than that, a lot of the boards we're seeing are more centered around negation, not so much destruction, and that really lends well to Eater of Millions. So even though Eater of Millions looks really bad on paper, it turns out that even though it looks bad on paper, in practice this card is absolutely insane for decks that just need that one extra card to sort of deal with their opponent's cards. If you have a board control deck like Frogs, those sort of decks, you definitely want to play Eater of Millions, because it totally just puts your opponent in a super awkward position. Every turn they're not getting rid of it, you're banishing another monster, and eventually they just get down to 0 cards, and you have an Eater of Millions with like 2,000 attack, and then you can finally just kill them with your deck's normal engine. But anyway, that is going to wrap up this video. You guys said you really liked the Gigantes sort of video the other day, which is sort of focusing on one card that's in the metagame a lot. So in today's video, I wanted to do the same thing with the card that I love so much, Eater of Millions. But I will see you guys later. Goodbye.